Welcome everyone to the latest Horizon 3 Biotech Investing webinar, hosted by Horizon 3 Biotech Fund and sponsored and conducted by FP Rice and Monsoon Communications. As you've heard, this webinar is being recorded. And you've all seen the disclaimer upon registration. Today, we're very fortunate to have two experienced biotech sector executives, Dr. Michelle Miller and Scott Power. Dr. Miller was appointed MD of Biotron almost 20 years ago with extensive experience in commercial drug development. Excuse me. She completed her PhD in the Faculty of Medicine at Sydney University. Her experience includes several years at Johnson & Johnson, developing anti-HIV gene therapeutics through preclinical research to clinical trials. She's also been an investment manager with a bioscience venture capital fund. Scott Power, known to many of the audience, and this is about your fourth or fifth one, I think, Scott, has been a biotech healthcare technology analyst for more than 20 years, investing in and researching emerging sector companies. Firstly, in his role in the venture capital industry with QIDC and more recently with Morgans, which he joined in 1997. Scott has a wide network of contacts across these sectors, which help with the identification of key trends and developments. Scott is also a member of the Horizon 3 Biotech Investment Committee. Scott's qualifications include a Bachelor of Commerce, graduate diploma in applied finance, and certified practicing accountant. Today, we'll be discussing Biotron, obviously, and the current ASX biotech market. So please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen anytime, and we will address as many of these as possible after we answer the pre-submitted questions, which we have 3 or 4 of. First, Matt on the Horizon, where I comment on some of the important developments locally and internationally impacting our sector and thus investment objectives. I'm going to need someone to help me out with the pronunciation of Astra's CEO, Pascal Soriot. How do we say that? Anyone know? Soriot. He's been knighted in the UK as a recognition of the UK farmers' work on a COVID vaccine. Now, Sir Pascal, the Australian AstraZeneca chief, was given the honour in the Queen's Birthday Honours 2022. He's led the company since 2012 and took over amid a tumultuous time as R&D setbacks and questions over management saw the company in the crosshairs of US pharma giant Pfizer. And while we're on knighthoods, Moderna's CEO, Stéphane Bancel, has been named a Chevalier, which is a Knight of the Legion d'Honneur, pardon my French, the highest French distinction for military and civil accomplishments. From the recent ASCO meeting, interim data for BioNTech's individualized mRNA cancer vaccine called autogene cevumeran in combination with Genentech's Tecentriq and chemotherapy showed that half of the treated patients posted a noticeable immune response, correlating with longer recurrence-free survival. Eli Lilly announced top-line results from 1-year analysis of the efficacy and safety of lebrikizumab, the company's investigational IL-13 inhibitor for the treatment of patients with moderate to severe atopic dermatitis. The new findings from the phase 3 clinical trials, Advocate 1 and 2, showed 8 out of 10 patients who achieved clinical response with the drug monotherapy at 16 weeks maintained skin clearance at 1 year of treatment with once every 2 weeks or 4-week regimen. Bristol Myers Squibb is picking up Turning Point Therapeutics in a US $4.1 billion acquisition. BMS will gain access to repotrectinib, a mid-stage candidate for testing for first-line lung cancer as a potential competitor to Roche's Rozlytrek. And finally, Emergent Biosolutions, which made errors in producing 2 companies' COVID-19 vaccines, which caused millions of doses to be discarded, has notified J&J it is in the crosshairs for up to $420 million for a material breach in breaking their contract manufacturing agreement. Now, to our panelists. Michelle, can I start with you, please? For the members of the audience who don't know Biotron, can you tell us about your lead antiviral compound, BIT225, and clinical trials for HIV and hepatitis?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm delighted to be here today and to update those familiar with Biotron and to tell people who aren't familiar, give some background and information about our company. So Biotron is a small molecule antiviral company. Our main focus is HIV and HIV eradication. We also have a very promising hepatitis B program, but over the last couple of years, our main, apart from our HIV, we've been focusing on coronaviruses, in particular COVID-19. Biotron spun out from the ANU, from the John Curtin School, quite some time ago now. I think one of the early companies to list with a multiplicity of different programs back in around 2000, and go to the ASX for funding for that. But really our main focus has been on the antivirals. And why we're so interested in this and why we're getting a lot of interest in what we do is we have a different way of targeting viruses than most of the other ways that people in the world target. Generally, there's nukes, which is the standard way to attack viruses, and most of the other drugs in development work that way. The bit that we're targeting viruses are called viroporins. And why they matter is that these proteins are really absolutely critical for not just the replication, but more in terms of the infectivity and the pathogenesis of the virus. For example, with COVID, we're targeting a particular protein called the E protein. And that's the protein that's responsible for setting up all of the problems that happen in COVID. You know, if you're infected with SARS-CoV-2, the cytokine storm or the congestion, the infiltrates and whatever in the lungs, all of that set off by this particular protein in coronavirus. So we're the one, we target that particular protein. So you're actually stopping that whole process starting at the beginning. Our programs for the HIV, to date, we've completed with BIT225, it's a small molecule, not an antibody type drug, it's just a normal oral drug. We've done completed 9 clinical trials, and we've got 2 HIV trials, phase 2 trials that are running at the moment. We have had an interest in hepatitis C in the past, and we have safety data from that, and also the additional from PK data that supports the ongoing development of the drug, you know, for our HIV indication. The hepatitis B program is still in preclinical, and we're aiming to get to a first-in-man study in early 2023.
Okay, thank you. And can you tell us about the combination therapies and clinical data to support the eradication of the HIV virus?
Yeah, look, HIV is a really interesting one. There were some people say, oh, isn't HIV done and dusted? The reality is it's still a problem, and it's still a really very significant market. I think in 2021, the market was made, worldwide market was around the 20 billion, and it's expected to grow to about 36 billion by the end of this current decade. The reality is you still need to, people who are infected still need to take ongoing antiretroviral drugs. And there's still, the virus being present long-term means a lot of those patients don't fully immune reconstitute. So they still have ongoing problems. Our trials that we've done have been in combination with the existing antiretroviral drugs, because they're the core central thing that are needed to get the virus down quickly and keep it down. But there's still viruses present in the reservoirs, and what we've found in our the trial that came off a couple of years ago, our phase 2 trial, is that in patients who had our drug added in for 3 months on top of the standard antiviral drugs, really significant immune changes. How our drug works is by targeting this VPU protein. And the role of that protein is to keep the virus levels so the immune system can't see it. They basically act to mask the cells. So by targeting that, we unmask the cell. So it means that things like the NK cells come back up, activated CD4s are back up, And these indicate the immune system's actually now primed and actually seeing the virus that's previously been hidden in the reservoir. So it's a way to, two things: improve the health outcome of the patients because you're improving their immune reconstitution, and also get rid of the virus because the immune cells can now get in there and actually see the virus that they couldn't see before.
Great. Okay, great. Can you tell us further about milestones Biotron is aiming to hit over the coming 2 years?
Yeah, look, our main focus, reiterate, is our HIV program. 2 phase 2 trials running at the moment, one in treatment naive patients in Thailand, and another one in treatment experienced here in Sydney. We expect both of those trials to complete before the end of this year, and in particular for the treatment experienced trial for data for that to come off as well in this second half of this current year. So that's a really important milestones, of course, is the data from those trials. We're also working on the next generation HIV drugs. We expect to be in a position to have those ready for safety studies by the end of this year. Our COVID program is the one that's receiving quite a bit of interest at the moment, of course. We're currently just had very good feedback from the FDA in terms of guidance for phase 2 trial and design of that. And we hope to be undertaking, that study this year. And they're fast trials as long as you can design it in such a way that you can recruit quickly, which more challenging sometimes in the design of things than you might think. Going into next year, 2023, the aim would be to take that into phase 3. Hepatitis B, we'd like to have a lead ready into human safety studies beginning of next year as well. And of course, our main thing is not just the R&D, but partnering. Our aim is not to take these through to registration and approval. Our aim is to partner it, and that's really the absolute prime focus. And on the back of solid additional HIV data, understanding more about how the immune modulation works, which we'll get from this trial, and the COVID data, we expect to be in a good position in terms of partnering.
So you've mentioned partnering, and you're an ASX listed company, so there's things you can't say. What can you tell us about any progress with commercial partnerships? Look,
we continue to engage with partners. And I have to say the last couple of years and COVID has made some of the conversations and things a bit more challenging due to the distraction that COVID has caused within the industry, within the antivirals. We get very positive feedback. We know what we have to achieve. I know the groups that we're talking to. So we're pretty comfortable about that. I think I just mentioned about the coronavirus or the COVID work in particular, that that's an ever-changing landscape from a commercial perspective. It was an emergency situation before was there even going to be a vaccine. Fortunately, there has been. The case numbers in terms of deaths are down, but the case numbers are still pretty horrific. And the death numbers, while they're not like they were, the rates are still pretty high. The 2 drugs that have been developed, Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, the Merck and Pfizer drugs, they were approved they went through trials that got them through very quickly, but there's still some questions around the efficacy of those drugs. So there's still an absolute need and a real interest in developing drugs that will work better, perhaps than they do. But you need the hurdle. There's a hurdle there. You need to actually do the trials or do a trial and show it works. Hand waving and getting through quickly. The FDA now is scrutinizing everything in the appropriate way to make sure. And farmers want to see some clinical data on how these drugs work.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Now, Scott, I'm going to heap all this trouble on you now. The market has been very disappointing these last 6 months. Has the biotech sector just got caught up in the interest rate rise being factored in, or are there fundamentals impacting our sector?
Yeah, good day, Matt, and everyone. Yeah, look, I think they have. I think it's just been caught up in the larger macro picture that we've seen over the last 6 months. So you've seen the NASDAQ down about 25%, the NASDAQ Biotech Index similarly down that amount. Australia's been a little bit more insulated here. Our healthcare market's down about 10% since the beginning of the year. But really what's happening on the macro front is that interest rates are heading up. So you've seen that 10-year bond rate in the US up around 3%. In Australia, the 10-year bond rate's 3.5%. And the RBA sort of moved aggressively during the week, and they're really trying to sort of combat inflation. So what the RBA is seeing and told the market is that they're looking at an inflation rate of about 4.75% in Australia. And remember, their target's around 2 to 3%. So that's what they want to try and get back to. So the question is, how quickly does the world sort of get back to more normal rates of inflation? So we really need to see those supply chain issues resolved, the Ukrainian conflict settle down, and some of those type labor rates, start to moderate. And that's our view. It's probably going to take another sort of 6 months or so for that to start to moderate. So that's really what we're looking for, to try and get some stability back into the market. So, the healthcare biotech market really has been caught up in that whole macro picture.
Yeah. And from yours and Morgan's perspective, what are some of the biotech stocks that have held up better than others, and why, do you think?
Yeah, so there have been a few, not many, I must say. So when we talk about the biotech sector or the healthcare sector, we really break it into four buckets, I guess. So there's biotech and pharma, diagnostics, medical devices, and services and tech. And the key factors that have seen some of these companies, which I'll mention shortly, hold up reasonably well. Those with very strong cash backing, or are profitable, or they have a near-term catalyst coming, or they have some sticky shareholders, that are long-term and prepared to sort of ride out this volatility, or some corporate activity. So let me sort of point to 5 companies that have, held up reasonably well. The first one is Neuren. They had some very good clinical data coming through for trofinetide. They've got a good cash backing, and they've got a near-term catalyst of potentially licensing out the rest of the world. The next one is Antares Technology. Again, a solid cash position, and they've got a very sticky shareholder sitting in there. So, they've done really well.
How much does that sticky shareholder own? Like, is it 20, 40%?
Yeah. The major shareholder's got over 50%, and then there's a couple of institutions in there that are, also substantial. So, that's really, kept the liquidity very tight. Third company I'll just point to is Promedicus. It's a profitable business. Again, very strong cash position. That share price, has been reasonably steady over the last, 3 or 4 months. Hexamer, again, due to have some clinical data out shortly, that share price has been fairly solid. That's a company sort of expected to report their phase 2 fungal nail infection results shortly. And just finally, on the corporate front, we've got corporate activity in a number of areas across healthcare, but I'll just point to Virtus in the IVF space. I think we're going to see a lot more corporate activity coming through. So, with some of these depressed share prices, I think we can expect to see, the next 6 months, a number of takeover bids or M&A activity continue.
Yeah, and in your, yours or Morgan's opinion, is the IPO window completely shut?
It's not completely shut, but it's very difficult. Whether if you're coming in through an IPO or even a secondary raising, it's very difficult. So this year you've seen just a couple of IPOs. So there was Microba, and then a couple of the earlier. Or a couple of secondary raisings. So Telix and I think Lumos yesterday did another raising. So that was a sort of rights issue that sort of was very sharply priced, and that compares with 2021, where there's something like $8 billion raised. So 6.5 of that was with CSL. But 1.6 billion in 2021 was raised across the healthcare market in Australia, and that was across dozens of companies. So, it is now very difficult. There's no doubt about it, and I think we can expect it to stay like that for another 6 months.
Well, you might have just preempted the next question. What advice can you give the biotech executives in the audience who will need to raise cash in the next 6 to 12 months?
Sure. So just a couple of suggestions, really. I think you've got to look to your existing shareholder base, to help with that. And as I mentioned, Lumos just before, I think, so they went back to their shareholder base with a rights issue. I think you've got to be really very realistic with the pricing at the moment. Clearly, if you need to raise money, your share price in most instances is substantially below what it was 6 months ago, and therefore you need to be realistic with that. Perhaps looking at your existing cash balance and reprioritizing, or conserving the cash as best you can. And I think Michelle mentioned just looking for your partnerships and your strategic investors and all that. That's probably where you can perhaps explore perhaps more aggressively than what you might have done originally.
Sound advice, thank you. Now we will take additional questions from the audience, so please use that Q&A button on your Zoom screen to submit your questions. We do have a few submitted questions, pre-submitted questions. Apologies to those that ask forward-looking questions. ASX listed companies cannot answer these without a formal ASX announcement. But Michelle, there's a few questions for you. Edward asked, is the COVID trial phase 2A or 2B? And upon completion of the success of that trial, what is the expected timeline for phase 3 application FDA trial?
So first of all, generally, there's not a lot of distinction really between 2A and 2B. Phase 2s are very fluid, and generally we just call the trial a phase 2, whether it's a 2A or 2B. So it's difficult at this stage to make the distinction between those, and we also haven't announced the design and details of such a study, so I'm not able to say much more about that. In terms of phase 3, just to clarify, the phase 2 that we're likely to do, whether we do that in the US under an IND or outside of the US without an IND, it's all IND enabling. An IND simply means that you're doing your trial in the US. That's the approval process for doing that. So for phase 3, while it would be likely to be done under an IND, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be done under an IND. It just needs to be IND enabling, just to clarify those points, because I think there's a bit of confusion with people what an IND actually means. But we'd be the back of a phase 2, aiming to move into a phase 3, in 2023. Just to reiterate, Biotron's aim is not to actually take drugs through the approval process and through marketing. Our aim is to get sufficient data to partner it. We consult with the FDA. We've had guidance from the FDA, because it's important that the trials are done with markers and endpoints that the FDA is going to accept in the ever-changing COVID landscape. But we're very focused on generating data for a partner rather than to get a drug through the approval process as quickly as possible. Certainly, cash available in Australia for doing big trials is always very difficult. And I think Australian companies that have taken drugs through to phase 3 and beyond on their own have not always been particularly successful with that process. I think it's a brave biotech company in Australia that takes drugs themselves into phase 3 and beyond. Don't quote me on that.
I'm going to combine these next two questions because it's to do with funding and related issues. I'll just read them out. Steve asked, what are the timelines for the next stages for the HIV rollout, which I think you've talked about then? What is the position regarding funding? Are you now looking at appointing a specialist director to move the business from development and trial stage to taking to market stage? I think you've just answered that. You're more interested in partnering. And then David asked, can you please update the market regarding funding and if there will be a dilutive credit raising?
Once again, as always, with being ASX listed, I can only say what's in the public domain.
Yep.
As we have already stated previously, our HRV trials are funded. We are currently working out our capital requirements for the proposed COVID trial. Biotron's always been very careful with its capital raising. We don't just go out and with a wish list and hand wave to do a capital raising. We do it, raise just what we need to do specific activities. So once we understand exactly what those activities and the costs of those are, we'll look at the funding, best way to fund those. We are, as always, exploring non-equity funding. We've always been, I think, very careful, as I said, with our capital raising. We don't do debt raisings. We've always had success with it. And we take into consideration shareholders when we do capital raise.
Yep. Now, Steve's asked 3 further questions, which I think you've answered them, but just in case you need to add anything else, when will the next stage of the trials be completed for COVID? It doesn't seem that there is any near-term this year partnership announcements. Is that correct? And how far off are Biotron to bring any of their solutions to market?
Okay, but first of all, in terms of when's the COVID trial going to finish, we haven't yet announced the start of that. Once we announce the start of that and we understand exactly what the recruitment and the recruitment timelines are going to be, we'll be able to say about that. At the moment, I don't have any specific information that I can share. In terms of partnership opportunities, we continue to engage with pharma. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. Would we like to have a partnership this year? Absolutely. Once again, you don't know what's going to happen next in terms of timelines. So I don't know that you can say either way. And in terms of solutions to markets, once again, our aim is to have a partner. We're deep into phase 2. The aim is to get to a partner and then get it through to the market with them as quickly as possible, rather than ourselves take it.
Okay, thank you. Scott, question from Tim Borum. What ASX biotechs do you see as the biggest winners and losers from COVID, and what have investors learnt from the pandemic?
The biggest winners from COVID, boy. I think perhaps maybe if I sort of rephrase that question a little bit, given so many of the companies have fallen so far, the question I'm now getting asked is, which are your best picks for the next 6 months? So if we go back to those few sort of requirements that we noticed that companies are still holding their share price shares, good cash balance, near-term catalysts, solid shareholding base. The companies that have fallen a long way but still sort of meet those criteria, companies like ImpediMed, Max7, EBR, 3 companies that certainly got plenty of cash in the bank, some near-term catalysts, and a shareholding base that that's not too bad. So they will be the ones that I think will sort of bounce very quickly. Once we get this stability in the macro picture. In terms of the COVID beneficiaries, the testing rates are going to go down. So all those sort of diagnostic companies, that really, had that massive run, through 2020 and 2021 are sort of really coming right off the boil, and I have to sort of query whether, they're really going to bounce back that fast. So it's really sort of looking more broadly. Now, that doesn't quite answer Tim's question. In fact, I've sort of really turned that question on its head. But what we are getting asked now is, given these companies have fallen so far, and we're sort of 20 odd days away from the 30th of June, so there's going to be a little bit more tax loss selling coming through. And that's a really interesting point for, the more sort of for investors that, are prepared to sort of perhaps take a bit of a portfolio approach or starting to put a little bit of money to work. Because, I've got to be honest, I've really been out of favor, my sector, not for 6 months, but I'd say for 12 months, almost since, last August. We really felt like, investors were deserting the sort of emerging healthcare life science space. And then from October onwards, it was absolutely evident that, there was a rotation into more value-oriented. The growth, that the tech names were just sort of getting sold down aggressively, both by institution and retail shareholders. So, I've been much used to Morgans, for that period of time, because, most of my stocks have just been going nowhere or coming down. But now I'm at a point where people are starting to say, right, where can we put some money to work? So I've given you a couple of names there. Hopefully, that's useful for people on the line.
Great, thank you. Michelle, one more for you. Given your youngest patent has a priority date of 2007, how does Biotron plan to extend its IP timeline?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question. So first of all, for that particular patent, our HIV one, we already have quite a considerable extension on that through the US, through delays going through examination process. And we expect to get, so there's at least another 4 years on top of that from that. And we expect at least up to another 5 years on top of that again. Once it gets through the FDA processes there'll be another up to 5 years available. We've also filed additional patents. The coverage for the immunomodulation is a new PCT that's been filed. And the other thing is our next generation compounds. We have some really nice new compounds coming along. They're looking great in all the preclinical safety studies and things to date. So we're pretty comfortable in terms of the portfolio as a whole and ensuring the patent longevity of the portfolio as a whole.
Okay, that's great. Scott, final question. The ASX last year was getting a lot tougher on companies applying for IPO. What is the ASX specifically advising some of these companies as to why they are not suitable or ready for an IPO?
I think some of the feedback we're getting is, the stage they're at in the clinic. So, the early clinical companies or preclinical companies, I think, are being scrutinized. And also, how close you are to getting product registration and that sort of thing through is requiring a lot more explanation, to be able to sort of, get through the IPO process. But, again, essentially putting the ASX to one side because they've got their set of rules, to list a company, you're really looking for, for that strong shareholder base and that spread of investors that understand the story and have an ability, what we're seeing now, to keep funding, because a lot of these companies, do need follow-on funding, and it's really important that you have shareholders that are able to sort of come in and try and not only support the company at the IPO, but continue to support it, through its journey, whether it's through product registration, through clinical programs, or whatever. And that's where you get that successful, healthcare life science company.
Yeah, have we seen the same sort of scrutiny applied to the mining and resources companies? They say they've got a hole in the ground. That's very speculative. That's equivalent to preclinical, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and I think the ASX is becoming more strict on the resource companies as well.
Right.
I think there's been enough money lost by investors, over an extended period of time, that those sorts of rules are being tightened up. So your definition of a resource and how you explain it, then how you verify it, I think is becoming very much a part of what the ASX is looking for to try and sort of, protect shareholders as best they can.
Yep. Now, as I said, that was the last question, Scott, but I'm lying because fresh questions come through for you from Kirby. What biotechs do you see that are near or are cash flow positive that have been beaten down?
Yeah. So again, just going back to my sort of definition of, when we think about biotech, we put it into those 4 baskets. So biotech, pharma, diagnostic, device, and services. The one, that I think is nearest to, a cash flow break even or is Mac7, M7T. So it's a sort of mini Pro Medicus, if you like. Revenue stream, got plenty of cash in the bank, and it is absolutely been beaten up. There is, we've raised money on a couple of occasions for it at prices higher than where it is at the moment. I think it hit a high of $1.60. It's now sort of less than 60 cents. So that's the one that I think if the question is one company to pick, that does hit that definition of cash flow positive, cash in the banks, and shareholder base is sort of, mixed, I guess. But I think that one can move pretty quickly once the sentiment turns.
So we can expect a few of this audience to go and check out Mac7.
Yep.
We were chatting prior to. Oh, there's another question coming in, but we were chatting prior to this webinar, and we were talking about that there's hundreds of companies on the Nasdaq that are trading at less than cash. Are we seeing that on the ASX as well in the biotech sector?
Not necessarily trading below cash. I'm sure there's a couple. I'm sure I'll be proved wrong there, but certainly, there is a number that are getting back towards cash backing.
Yeah,
for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think that just to give your listeners a sort of sense of what the numbers are over on the Nasdaq, I think there's just under 200 companies that are trading below cash backing at the moment, and that compares with about 6 companies a year ago. So
right.
That just does give you an indication that prices have come right back. And as I said, this is perhaps time to be a little brave and start putting some money to work in a measured way.
Thank you for that. And I said there was one more question, Michelle. This will be the last question. Michelle, do you have any insight on the catalyst for the 3rd mice study for BIT225 for COVID-19?
Not quite sure exactly what they're asking by the catalyst. We've actually reported out the data from 3 mouse studies. The last study showed that at the time of addition that the drug had a very wide therapeutic window, that you got a protective effect if it was given before infection. The mice continued to be very healthy, didn't develop COVID. And if you started the drug treatment 48 hours into the infection, which is considering mice die by day 6 to 8, you're still a long way into the infection cycle, that you also protected them. I don't really understand quite what he means by catalyst for it. We don't actually anticipate doing any further mouse studies at this point. We've got quite a lot of data from that. Our focus now is moving into the human trials and understanding more about the mechanism of action in parallel.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to wind it up now. The next webinar will be Thursday, the 7th of July at 10:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Time. Dr. Tam Nguyen, who's been tagging with me, is another Horizon 3 Biotech Investment Committee member, will be your host on that occasion. Thank you to the audience for your feedback and suggestions are most welcome. Appreciate the questions from those that asked them. Thanks go to FB Rice and Monsoon Communications for sponsoring and hosting the webinar. And finally, thank you again to Scott and Michelle for joining us. And on behalf of the Horizon 3 Biotech team, goodbye for now and good investing. Thank you very much, Michelle and Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.